Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So this series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, May 16th, 1948, New York Governor Thomas E. Dewey and former Minnesota Governor Harold Stassen are preparing for a presidential debate that would take place the next day. Both of them were running in the Republican primary. This debate was a few days ahead of the Oregon primary, which is all, this is somewhat interesting. But the thing about this debate, it is the first nationally broadcast presidential debate, the first one available on the radio for all to hear. And another interesting wrinkle is that the entire debate was focused on discussing the legal status of the Communist Party in the United States. So one provocative question for the entire debate. So look, people talk about Lincoln Douglas and Kennedy Nixon. Here to help put Dewey Stassen in its rightful place on the Mount Rushmore of great American debates are, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hey there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So we'll see at the end. Listeners can judge whether this should be in the pantheon. But first, I think one important context is in terms of the timing and the importance of this debate. Usually in modern elections and more recent elections, as we get towards the tail end of the primary process, it's kind of like playing out the string because modern primaries, you accumulate delegates as you go, and you kind of know what's going to happen by this point. 1948, very different circumstances. This is the era when the people who are going to be the nominees, it's really going to happen at the convention, and everything is just sort of jockeying and positioning for the convention. So just to lay that context, NIki, we have this Oregon primary and this debate ahead of the Oregon primary that actually really will have a big impact.
Yeah, part of this is just about persuading delegates who is the most electable. It's this really weird period in American history where you have these presidential primaries, but the primaries don't mean that much in terms of racking up the delegates, that it's about sort of proof of concept more than anything else. And so this is an important debate because Dewey had been the frontrunner for this nomination. And then all of a sudden, Harold Stassen comes out of the woodwork as the dark horse candidate who starts racking up wins. Everyone's like, where'd this guy come from? And now this is the one chance for Dewey to show that he is defeatable.
Yeah. It is worth noting there were still, I think, about 7 candidates in the mix, and so only 2 of them decide to take part in this debate. It is kind of coming down to Dewey and Stassen. And one note about Stassen was known as the boy governor of Minnesota, elected governor of Minnesota at age 31.
Yeah.
10 years before this, he'd been elected at age 31 of governor and had already been elected twice. But anyway, Kellie, what else?
I think it's kind of fascinating that, there's 7 people competing, only 2 people show up because nobody wants to go to Portland. Like, if you think about, 1948, the transportation or how long it would take to get out there, Portland feels very remote for a lot of people or inaccessible to a lot of people. And so these are the 2, that show up. And it shows you why historical context is so important, because if you think in current elections when you have 15, 20 people running and everybody wants that screen time, everyone is going to show up. Right. This is almost the exact opposite, where it's almost like it's burdensome to go to this debate to discuss this issue.
Well, it's also interesting that because this was the first nationally broadcast one, you would think that maybe people would see that and say, oh, wait a minute, this is different, right? This isn't just some regional thing where I might have another chance. Oh, this is nationally broadcast. But maybe it was just so novel that people didn't get their heads around the fact that the power of a national broadcast.
Yeah, I mean, people don't really know what the consequence of participating in the debate is going to be. And it's interesting, right, that it's also on this very narrow question of should the Communist Party be outlawed or not, which actually was the question chosen by Dewey for them to debate, which gives you a sense of what he saw as the big difference between himself and Stassen.
Yeah. Well, and so let's lay out the contours of that debate. Because I will say, that actually of the two elements of this debate, the fact that it was built around one question and the fact that it was on the radio for the first time, I actually think the fact that it was built around one question and the nature of this question might be the most interesting thing. But, my instinct would be if you pick in a Republican primary, you have this very sort of provocative question, should the Communist Party be outlawed? And it is 1948. My instinct would be, well, everyone's going to say yes, right? That's the easiest answer. Sure. Primaries, are like about the base, but it actually ends up being more nuanced than that.
Yeah. When we back up, I just want to set up the context a little bit, because the way that we think about these debates, again, are completely different. So each candidate has 20 minutes to give their opening remarks.
Right.
That's a long time. Even in radio, I mean, most opening remarks, you've got 2 minutes, max 3 minutes. Each rebuttal is 8.5 minutes. So, I mean, this is a really long stretch of time to be giving a response, to be talking and keeping, the audience's attention at the same time. Usually what, makes this sort of rapid fire is the fact that you only have 60 seconds or 2 minutes to respond.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, it gives you a sense of how different the media environment was. And I could imagine people listening to this looking back longingly at the idea that you could actually sit with an idea and talk about it and debate it over the course of something longer than a 60-second soundbite.
Well, and to channel Marcia McLuhan here, I think the medium really does have an effect on the way that this can play out and the kinds of conversations that can play out. So, NIki, this ends up being quite a nuanced debate, I would argue, in part because of the amount of time and the way that it was set up. So what are the nuances as you see it of how they hashed out this question, should the Communist Party be banned?
So it is a set of core principles that they simply disagree on. So Stassen believes that, yes, the Communist Party is an existential threat to the United States. It's 1948, so there was a lot of evidence of the Communist Party taking over countries in Eastern Europe. There was the beginnings of the Red Scare beginning to settle in the United States. And so, of course, what you're going to do is you're going to prevent this party from really taking hold in the U.S. by simply outlawing it, or in this case, it's a little more nuanced than this, but we'll say effectively outlawing it. And Dewey comes in with the rebuttal, which is that no, you don't become like them by doing what they would do by outlawing a political party. What you do is you allow for the debate to happen, for the free exchange of ideas. And that's how liberal democracy defeats totalitarian communism, because people will choose democracy instead. And so out there in the free market of ideas, democracy will win.
Yeah, it's interesting. Dewey has this great line where he's like, you can't shoot an idea with a gun. And it's this idea that if you outlaw the Communist Party, you in a sense force them to go underground, force even more nefarious behavior. So that if you keep these ideas out in the public, you can contain it, you can control it, you can combat the propaganda or the messages that are being put forth. And so for him, it's almost important that the communist light have as much light shed on it as possible.
Interesting. Yeah. And, this is clearly a theoretical question, but it was also a pressing question in the sense of there was some legislation that was advancing that, as you were saying, NIki, it wouldn't specifically outlaw the Communist Party. I think everyone recognized the sort of constitutional problems there, but it would effectively outlaw the party. And so there was legislation that they end up in the debate kind of taking sides on the specific piece of legislation. One tidbit that I find fascinating is that in rebutting this legislation and this larger question of how can we basically curtail communism without actually banning it in law, Dewey ticked off a list of 27 laws already on the books that he said that could be used to fight plots and conspiracies and fight communism. And again, just think about the format. Imagine in a modern debate on CNN if someone was like, "Okay, I have a list of 27 things. Here we go." But the fact that there was space for that.
We've got 8.5 minutes, so
yeah,
that's right.
It's a lot of time to fill up space.
That's right. I think that's a really important point about the legislation that was already in circulation. We should say that one of the authors of that legislation was Richard Nixon, who would become a pivotal figure in the Red Scare and the fight against communism over the next decade. He would become kind of one of the leading Cold Warriors and fervent anti-communist in the United States. So this also just captures a moment when, not only are politicians focusing more and more on communism as a threat, but they are opening up the range of possible responses to it. And that could include, cleaning out the government for people who are suspected communists, going after people in Hollywood, passing new legislation, and then also things like this, like, do you outlaw the Communist Party? It's a really interesting moment where everything seems on the table, in part because Joe McCarthy hasn't emerged. Yeah. He would emerge a few years later as the face of this Red Scare moment, but he hasn't emerged and he hasn't been discredited yet.
Well, though interesting tidbit, Nixon is floating around, McCarthy's floating around too. He's actually in Portland at that debate as one of Stassen's kind of surrogates for there. So yes, you can see all the threads starting to come together.
And we should say that, this debate is widely heard. 40 million people tune in to this debate. That's incredible when you think about the times, the numbers, all of 56 news outlets, are all there in attendance to report on this debate. So it becomes one of the biggest news stories of the day, and for sure in that moment.
Yeah. So as we wrap up, let's talk about the fact that this was on the radio. This was the first nationally broadcast debate. The numbers are huge, but tell me if you disagree. But, my read on it is that the fact that it was on the radio didn't maybe change the nature of the debate that much, that maybe they had the same debate they were going to have regardless. It's just that more people heard it.
I think that's right. I mean, you're able to hear directly from the candidates instead of having it filtered through the journalist's eye, which is how people would otherwise be experiencing this debate, right? They would read the report on it in their local paper the next day. And instead, they have an opportunity to hear directly from the candidates. And there's a real power in that, right? In an era before television, in an era when radio really is the cutting edge technology, the idea that you can hear directly from candidates, can hear them engage in this kind of debate is a novelty. And it's also something that feels like you're getting a fly on the wall view of politics, because this is something that you would never have had the chance to hear before unless the debate was happening somewhere where you were local.
And I think a lot of this plays into Dewey's success. So he wins the debate and then goes on to win the presidential nomination.
And he defeated Truman, right? I think I saw that headline, right?
The headline.
There was a headline.
There was that infamous headline of Dewey defeats Truman that was printed way too soon before the information came out. So we know that Truman wins, but this does not stop Stassen. He actually runs 10 more times until his death in 2001. So talk about persistence.
Seriously.
Yeah, well, I guess if you start your political career that early as the boy governor, you can do that. But my gosh, I did not realize he'd run 11 times. Wow.
He seems a little addicted to running for president. It's like 4 years come around, man, gotta go hit that campaign trail again.
It's like the cicadas of running for president.
But, I think that also is part of this idea that when you get a certain amount of media momentum, that people believe that some of these things become foregone conclusions when we think about who's getting the most attention or press or etc.
Right. And I mean, certainly this is pure speculation, but you would think that if, as we were saying, primaries in this moment are geared towards really the party elites who are going to then kind of coalesce at a convention and pick the nominee, that I did really well in the first radio debate. I know how to handle the kind of thing that's coming, probably sends a decent message. And so maybe that played in. Again, I don't know exactly, but, that's my hunch. I'd be curious to see, we can do more episodes about this, but I'd be curious to see, how quickly people start to think about the medium of radio and how to message on radio and how debates maybe get reformatted. And then obviously I think the big kind of leap is radio to TV, and there's that famous debate between Nixon and Kennedy, where people who listen to it on the radio versus people watching on TV. Is that we'll do this an episode? Is that apocryphal?
It is. It is historically inaccurate. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Great. Well, there we go. Now there's an episode for us. But obviously, television is a whole other ballgame. But yeah, I think that the newness of it here, maybe it was so new that people hadn't really dug in and thought about how to take advantage of the medium, but they would obviously quickly do that.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's a good place to leave it, and we now have some future episodes to touch on, but Nicole Hemmer, thanks as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
And we should say, before we go, you have an op-ed coming out at the Times today?
Yeah, it'll be out in the Sunday issue on May 16th. I've written an op-ed about the new show on Starz called Run the World. And the whole op-ed is just about Black women and friendship and joy. And this new show is being dubbed the Black Women's Sex in the City. And so I'm just talking about what it means to watch TV that makes Black women and really all women feel good.
Awesome. All right. People look for that. And if we're in plugging mode, NIki, you just recorded with Ezra Klein. You're going to be on his podcast.
Yes, I should be on there in probably the day that this comes out, I think.
Great. Oh, perfect. Same day. All right. So after you're done listening to this, folks, you have plenty of other things to dive into. All right. This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. You can get in touch with us with any questions or comments or ideas for the show. Email us thisdaypod@gmail.com, or you can find a form at thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
I ask then, why is it that the Communist Party organization has been growing so strong in New York?
We have a lot of communists in New York. We have a great many of them, and they cause us great trouble. But we lick them by the biggest majority in history. Why? Because we kept them out in the open. Because we everlastingly believe in the Bill of Rights. Because we know that if in this country we will always keep every idea that's bad out in the open, we will lick it.
Radiotopia.